indicating that you should discontinue outdoor work when you're in the hazardous as well as actually the unhealthy and very unhealthy areas based on the AQI, the air quality index. To be clear, that is not enforceable guidance. It is a very strong recommendation. In all likelihood, will remain below the particulate PEL. Really, if you've got people doing work outside, especially if they're doing strenuous work, wait for a bit of rain. And if you can put them in N95s or even KN95s that are that they're able to fit test, those normally wouldn't be approved respirators, but since you're not over the PEL anyway, I think the KN95 is if you can fit test it is a suitable alternative, and that is the position that we have taken. We will not consider that to be a violation based on respirator selection. I apologize for being late and for dropping right into the middle of the conversation, but that's sort of our perspective on the AQI issue.
That was absolutely perfect, Michael. I'm glad you could join us. We were trying to make sure we could connect you. So I don't know if you want to go back to the beginning and introduce yourself to folks. And I will let the participants know I did start recording as soon as Michael sort of penetrated our meeting. And so you're all being recorded, and we'll share the recording after it's over.
So you've all got me on record saying we won't cite you for KN95s.
Maybe.
Well, I just said it again. So for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Michael Wood. I'm a member of the American Society of Safety Professionals, Cascade, or not Cascade, excuse me, Columbia Willamette chapter, Sandy Am section. But probably the reason I was invited to talk with you today is I'm also the administrator of OR-OSHA, where I have been on the job now for 15 years. So I've had the opportunity to chat with you folks on more than one occasion, and I appreciate the fact to chat with you a bit today. So did you have any other things you need to take care of before I just talk a little bit about the issues that we've got in front of us right now?
I think most of us are here to hear what you have to say and hear about the rulemaking that's happening around COVID. And I think any of our business can be delayed till the end if time allows. Lance Hughes, tell me if you disagree.
No, I think we're here for Michael.
We're here for you, Michael.
Okay. Well, so as everybody knows, I think we have been doing COVID-related enforcement really since to some extent since the pandemic broke, but certainly since the governor issued the "Stay Home, Stay Safe" order back in March. We have received pushing 12,000 complaints related to COVID. In a normal year, we receive a total of 2,000 complaints in the entire year. So far, we've received right around 2,000 complaints on non-COVID issues this year, probably because we've been more visible, so people can find our complaint website and raise other issues. And then, of course, that number spiked this weekend with the ones that we received based on air quality. This was the first stretch of time where we received more complaints not related to COVID than related to COVID, and it's entirely because of the issues around the smoke in the air. So that is kind of sitting out there. We've been enforcing where there is applicable workplace guidance, the OHA guidance issued under the authority of the governor's executive orders and emergency declaration. We've also, in some cases, used just a straight up general duty analysis and have looked at the general obligation to provide a safe and healthful workplace and whether employers were doing enough to ensure that there was separation between workers, barriers between workers, and in some contexts that aren't addressed by the OHA guidance, the use of facial coverings. We actually view the rulemaking that we have proposed as a step back in the direction of normal operations. Now, it's It's a temporary rule intended to address this emergency. It's a COVID rule rather than just an infectious disease rule. But the temporary rule is intended to put it back where we're addressing things in the context of our rulemaking authority, and explicitly looking at enforcing our rules rather than enforcing, at least for workplace exposures, which is where our jurisdiction runs. We won't be relying on OHA and the guidance documents they issue. Now our requirements will align initially with what they have on the books. So in that sense, there are aspects of the rule that are really just a continuation of the order that we've been operating under. But as I said, it's an effort to move things more toward regular business. So we issued a draft rule that for low risk workplaces, which pretty much in the draft rule is everything that's not direct patient care in healthcare, or the service industries where you're actually the target, if you will, of the work activity is another human being. So things like tattoos, salons, really all that personal services stuff is kind of the middle tier. The rest of it falls under the general requirements, and the general requirements really were intended to be sort of threefold. A set of requirements around distancing, basically focusing on the 6-foot distancing where it's practical, going to a 3-foot distance in vehicles, which is not unprecedented. It's actually what we've had in our ag rule from the outset. And of course, the World Health Authorities is still using a meter. That's not really sufficiently protective, but that's where they are in even their general distancing guidance. And then and then an expectation that where you can't reliably maintain a 6-foot distancing, that you would be having all individuals involved wear facial coverings, and those are really things that we're by and large expecting in most workplaces today. The other piece we sort of missed through a drafting error, and so we ended up with different requirements for high contact surfaces and high touch surfaces. You may have a hard time thinking of those terms and thinking of them as actually having different meanings. They really don't. And we inadvertently ended up writing a requirement to clean high touch surfaces between every use, which had people thinking that would mean that the doorknobs needed to be cleaned every time somebody went through them. That none of that was our intention. So there is a piece of the sanitation stuff in the rule that had everybody concerned that we just flat out screwed up in the drafting. And so that will go back to the regular cleaning schedule and a cleaning frequency for those high contact surfaces, requirements probably around shared equipment for the ability to clean them between users, but not looking at cleaning all high contact surfaces between uses. And so really it's a recognition that sanitation is not as big an issue as we sort of all thought it was in March, that this is less about contact transmission and more about droplet transmission. We'll probably in the final rule also have a little bit of guidance that can work in a temporary rule related to aerosol transmission. The best information we have from Oregon Health Authority and others on the state of the science is that the primary transmission method is droplets, even short-term airborne droplets, everything but the smallest. But there clearly is a potential, and in some cases, it clearly seems to be documented that there are aerosol transmissions that have occurred, and they certainly have a risk of occurring at longer distances, creates more concern about office environments, certainly makes us think that we have to pay attention to whether our air intakes are cleared, maybe looking at making sure that the filter is as upgraded as much as possible. Probably in ventilation systems, looking at boosting your fresh air intake, not this week, but in times where there's such a thing as fresh air, introducing more fresh air into the workplace so that you're not just recirculating the same potentially contaminated air. We'll probably have a bit more information about that in the final rule. We're hoping to finalize the rule sometimes next week. This is the temporary rule. We will publish it essentially in its final form, and then we'll provide 10 days before we adopt it. We've had a lot of requests that it be delayed by a month or 60 days or 90 days. We certainly aren't going to do that across the board because putting a delayed effective date in would mean that those things we're enforcing right now, we wouldn't be able to enforce during that effective date. So the issues about distancing and facial coverings, we basically want a seamless transition from the OHA guidance to the Oregon OSHA rule. Other things, to the degree that there are documentation requirements or training requirements or plan requirements, those will likely have a delayed effective date. It won't be 90 days. It doesn't really make sense to put something in a 180-day rule that you have to put a 90-day phase in on. So if there's something that we think is that ambitious, we'll probably end up just considering it an issue that needs to be addressed in permanent rulemaking. We do plan to engage in permanent rulemaking. There are two distinct components to that. Part of it is that realistically, we aren't going to be done with this next March. And once the temporary rule has run its course, we can't readopt it, we can't renew it or extend it. And so to the degree that we want to continue to have COVID requirements in place, want to continue is probably the wrong phrase, to the degree we feel that we're going to need to have COVID specific requirements in place, we need to do that in what is called a permanent rule. But in that context, permanent just means in place more than 180 days. And so it isn't like we'll have facial covering requirements in that rule. That isn't a declaration that Oregon OSHA is planning on making people wear facial coverings forever. And so the use of permanent is a little bit confusing in that sense. We do think that there are, as long as we're doing all this work, that we should address infectious diseases, particularly in higher risk environments. California's had an infectious disease rule basically for healthcare and related fields for a number of years. We think that there's a rationale for taking a similar approach and probably having some basic requirements about infection control and awareness even in the general workplace. I think the pandemic has sort of highlighted how little thought most of us really give to those issues in the context of employee safety. And then the other thing that we'll try to do for the general workplace is probably begin the process of developing a bookshelf of potential rules, if you will, that we can adopt on an emergency basis using the same temporary rulemaking authority we're talking about now, but that will have pre-vetted. So if we want a facial covering requirement, we'll have already thought about things like, what about radio transmissions in emergencies? So we'll have the rule, and of course we've got some of it now, but we'd have a rule that we could pull off the shelf and adopt on an emergency basis, but we wouldn't be starting from scratch. When we adopted the rule for agriculture last May, we got a petition, we got a lot of comments on the petition, both for and against it. And then we literally ended up drafting that rule about 3 days before we adopted it. That's never a great process, no matter how good we are. A rule that gets drafted that quickly is going to have glitches in it that we don't anticipate. And so the ability to have a stakeholder process, but still to move quickly, and to sort of, if we had that bookshelf now and we were looking at last March, in March we would have said, oh, we need to do distancing, we need to do sanitation. Sometime in April, we probably would have said, well, we should put the facial covering rule in place. That's, I think, really for most workplaces, that's likely to be the primary impact over the indefinite term. So those really are the things we're doing on infectious diseases. We already talked about what we're doing right now in relation to wildfire. There is a requirement in the governor's executive order issued last spring that we in OHA work to develop proposed rules around wildfires, including issues about wildfire smoke. wildland, excuse me. And so that rulemaking is down the road. Obviously, there are some folks who are thinking that it shouldn't be very far down the road, given the current situation in which we find ourselves. So that's sort of the broad brush. I want to talk a little bit about what enforcement has looked like in the COVID context. I mentioned that we've had approaching 12,000 complaints, well over 11,000 now. Out of those, we have initiated a little over 100 inspections. So we're running right about 1%. The vast majority of the complaints we've addressed using either the phone fax process or a letter that allows us to engage with the employer, talk about what's required, including the fact that these, have been new requirements, and what the employer is prepared to do to come into compliance. Out of the 100 inspections that we've finished, that we've started, I think there are about 60 of them that have been completed. A little over 20 of those have resulted in violations. Those are all fairly small numbers. That's actually smaller than our percentage with violations normally. We run about 65 to 70% of our inspections generate a violation. And we're running lower than that on the COVID cases. What is remarkable is that half a dozen of the 14 cases that have, the 20 or so cases that have had violations have been willful. And frankly, to get cited willful in this context really means you don't listen when we do the phone fax investigation, or you don't respond. We come out and do the inspection, and you continue to tell us you're not going to comply. And it becomes really difficult at that point not to cite it willful. Some of the early willfuls were for businesses that were clearly operating in violation of the executive order's requirement that they be closed. And they knew about the requirement because they had in fact been closed and then had decided to disregard the closure order. More recently, they've been around facial coverings. Primarily, the willfuls have involved not enforcing it in relation to employees, but there also is an issue about enforcing it in relation to the public. For safety professionals, it's important to remember that when we're talking about facial coverings, we're talking about controlling the potential source of disease. So, not requiring customers in a store to wear facial coverings puts employees at risk. So it's absolutely in the context of our jurisdiction. We've had some folks say, well, how do you know there's a hazard? Well, it's a presumed hazard. Essentially, we view any individual as a potential source of COVID-19 infection. The best analogy I can probably draw to it is if you think about the bloodborne pathogen standard, it presumes that any blood is contaminated with a pathogen. That's not true of most blood. But in order to address the issue, we have to address the potential hazard, because we don't have an easy ability to distinguish blood that is pathogenic from blood that isn't. We have the same problem with individuals because of all the asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic, and mildly symptomatic cases and the potential that they are fully transmitting the disease to individuals when they don't even realize they have it. That's why we're being asked to exercise social distancing or distancing. We're trying to quit calling it social distancing, and that's why we're being asked, and we're enforcing facial coverings. They aren't respirators. Technically, they're not personal protective equipment. They're an engineering control that has all the unreliability and inconsistency of typical personal protective equipment because it's worn on the individual's face, but its primary purpose is source control, not personal protection. And so that's really the context in which we've been operating. We, of course, continue to enforce issues related to falls, machine guarding, getting struck by logs and other things in the woods. the add-on of the COVID responsibilities has sucked up a lot of resource and has certainly required us to get creative about how we can process that complaint volume. But we're still in business doing, as I saw a piece cross my desk on LinkedIn or Facebook or something on one of the groups I'm in that made the point that, the normal hazards haven't gone away because of this pandemic. And that is absolutely true. And I know that you folks, as you've tried to struggle with becoming infection control specialists, still have your regular jobs as well. And so I gave a speech last week at the Columbia Willamette chapter and made the observation that we haven't had an earthquake, we haven't had a tsunami, we haven't, they basically told me to shut up because they thought that I was jinxing us for October. Locusts is personally what I put on the calendar for October. I think it's going to be locusts. It just has a feel of Armageddon to it, I guess. So I guess with that, flammable snow. Okay, I like that one. So I'm going to have to add that. So that's really all I kind of had on my standard spiel. So obviously there's time for me to field any particular questions folks may have or concerns, or I normally say burning issues, but that seems like a bad choice of phrases right now.
So before we go there, I'll take hands and call on folks just to keep it from stepping on people's audio, which is hard and awkward when you're the one. I also, those who don't use Teams, there's a meeting chat that's available that includes the link that Christian placed to see the fire and the air quality conditions. Lee Manning from SAFE has offered that they have a whole bunch of wildfire resources, including some videos that are available to you through those links. So please make sure you take a look at some of those. Yeah, so I've got some hands up and I didn't catch you in order, so I apologize if I don't time it with you, but I see Guy Sylvie has a question.
Hey, Michael, good talking to you again.
Well, you get thanks for the flammable snow anyway. So
yeah, I recently rejoined Intel as the global director, and I just wanted to get your take on the air quality. We've shut down project completely for the last 3 days, and are you seeing that across the region as well regarding construction projects?
I think there are a lot of construction projects that have shut down. I know that, I mean, they're even, the Safeway that I shop at frequently has a Starbucks inside, and it was doing great guns business over the weekend because all the other coffee kiosks that do outside delivery have closed. I think many of those businesses that have the ability to shut down for a few days without that significantly affecting their ability to get the work done. In other words, it's a real challenge in ag, but I think a lot of businesses have done that. I don't have a sense of what people have done in the woods as much. And of course, depending on where you are, there may be logging sites that are actually in pretty good shape from a smoke standpoint, depending on where on a slope or on a summit they're working. And so there's more opportunity for variable conditions there. But I mean, we made the recommendation with OHA and made that very consciously. Now we were hoping that it would be raining by now. And it looks like that's not going to happen, and not going to happen as thoroughly as we'd all hoped. And now I guess the report is thunderstorms, which is never a good thing in fire season.
Yeah, exactly. The one area that we had to focus on is just to remind folks that N95s do and K95s do require fit testing. I think people quote unquote forget that often.
Yeah, and they say, and obviously every time we talk about it, we say properly fitted. On the other hand, if somebody slaps an N95 on their face without fit testing it, as opposed to going without entirely,
right,
probably getting protection than they would have otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, it looks like I've got Lance Hughes next and then Jim Johnson.
Yeah, Michael, my question is around, so I work for Eugene Water and Electric Board,
Right.
and my question is around employees that need to, based on the work that they're doing, work in close proximity, and sometimes in conditions that are contraindications for use of like non-FR rated mass, and there's communication issues that prioritize over maybe mass. So there's a number of reasons why we would have to work within close proximity, and the mass don't seem like a good fit. So my question would be on some of the engineering controls and the hierarchy of controls that we use, has Oregon OSHA thought about podding and how that might be used in a workplace? As I know it's used or referenced, in the governor's orders around if you're in a household, a family household, for example, it's not going to be useful to wear a mask. You're sharing the same air, the same space for long periods of time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around workplace podding.
We have limited it so far to discussions of households, and so in like the ag labor housing standard, we have not allowed artificial household creation or artificial podding in that context, as the state of Washington actually has, to get past some of the requirements there. It's important. I mean, when we talk about distancing, the draft rule actually says that you need to manage the distancing unless the employer can demonstrate it's impractical. Infeasibility is always a defense, and we'll probably acknowledge that explicitly in a note for all the folks who aren't as familiar with OSHA law. But OSHA law never prohibits work. To the degree we enforce a prohibition in the COVID context, it was because the governor adopted it. There are pesticides that are prohibited by other agencies from use, and if we ran across those in the workplace, we'd cite them based on the fact that they're not supposed to be used at all. But when you're talking about an OSHA or Oregon OSHA requirement, if it cannot be complied with feasibly and the work cannot be completed, then you do not have to comply with it. You have to take whatever protective measures you can or comply with it to the degree that you can. That's just the state of the law anytime we adopt a rule. Now, for distancing, we put practicality in, but when you talk about things like situations where you need to have FR or situations where you've got critical communication, we're not sure how much of that we're going to write into the rule. But for example, if somebody made the argument that a 911 dispatcher needs to be unmasked because they cannot feasibly do the work in the context and with the immediacy they're doing it, I would have a hard time questioning that. And that's true whether we acknowledge it in the rule or not. That feasibility argument would always be something that we'd have to accept.
Great. Okay, next we've got Jim Johnson, followed by Joe Stevens.
Yeah, Michael, I was curious if there were certain public health benchmarks that we as a society might achieve before these rules are repealed and we can kind of go back to normal. Is there an infection rate? Is there a fatality rate? Is there some other metric that we can look at?
So there probably is. Certainly there are benchmarks out there. How meaningful different benchmarks are is a little bit different challenge. Certainly one thing that is important, although it doesn't eliminate the risk and it doesn't eliminate the need to control for it, because part of what we're doing is controlling, and that's how we're getting the reduction. But the getting the infection rate below 1 and keeping it below 1 is one important public health indicator. What I don't think we want to do is get in a situation where we say, oh, we're below 1, so we can quit worrying about all this stuff, because then the next week you're above 1 again, and then you implement all the controls, you get below 1 again, you take them off. I think that there is a likelihood that we will have some level of workplace enforcement until there is an effective vaccine that has been put into widespread use. Because that's the only way, unless this thing does somehow die out, which I don't think is indicated. That's really the only way we get to a point where the controls aren't important to our continued success.
That's great information. Just for point of reference, if you're raised your hand and I called on you, I'm lowering your hand, so you'll have to put it back up if you've got a subsequent question. And we've got a question for you from Joe Stevens, nobody in the queue.
Hi, Joe Stevens, City of Eugene. I get a lot of questions about outside air coming from our HVAC systems, and I was wanting to know if there's like a minimum standard for the percentage of it, or any recommendations.
Other than the ASHRAE guidance, no.
Okay. Because we try to set with as much as possible, but it's usually determined by outside factors. Like this week, of course, we're like at 0. So,
I mean, you know, the other, I guess the general recommendation I'd make, after the ash and smoke get out of the air, is that I would just about max it. What you're going to lose is heating efficiency.
yes.
And so that doesn't come without a cost. But from the COVID prevention standpoint, the more outside air you're pulling in, the better off you are.
Right. And we try to maximize the most outside air, but depending on if the temperatures are too warm, our systems can't keep up if we're bringing in too much and stuff like that. So there's some environmental stuff, and I was just wondering if there was any kind of minimum standard on that. But
yeah,
I guess
I mean, ASHRAE has some guidance, but
okay.
it's general applicability.
We're usually at least 10%.
Yeah. And I guess just in the COVID context, this is a little bit like when you screw around with, there's that optimum range on your tires, and then there's certain types of performance. You either jack up the inflation or lower it a bit. You're still within the acceptable range. I think that's what you end up doing with the HVAC system. You need to stay in an appropriate range. But all other things being equal, to the degree that you can push up the outdoor air intake, the more outdoor air, the better. Not this leak.
Thank you.
When OHA put together that guidance, there was a piece in it that said, or driving with your windows up and your air recirculation on. And I said, we've been telling people for 6 months that they shouldn't do that if there's more than one of them in the car. So can we not completely throw the COVID communication issues out the window? But
all right, so it looks like we got a new hand. Christian, you're up.
Thanks, Tom. Michael. My name is Christian Newton. I'm a safety analyst with Eugene Water and Electric Board. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on the physical distancing for vehicles. Just a little clarification on the 6-foot rule in general, and then it's a 3-foot rule when you're in a worker or an employee or owned vehicle. And then I also had a second question regarding, it sounded like earlier you referenced masks as a engineering control kind of out of the hierarchy of controls. And if you could kind of define that a little bit better as well.
I actually think that facial coverings in this context are a good illustration of the fact that we describe the hierarchy of controls wrong. When we say engineer, I have a whole presentation on this that I've done for years, and I'm going to have to update it for COVID. From my perspective, the hierarchy of controls is about reliability and the degree to which you're relying on individual employee behavior. And so while technically the facial covering is a source control, which we would normally think of as an engineering control, it clearly doesn't have the reliability that we normally associate with engineering controls. But neither do all other engineering controls. If you think about it, you know, there's certainly a hierarchy within engineering controls. A guard is good. A guard that has an interlock on it is better for that very reason about reliability, and that you don't, that it takes a conscious effort to defeat it. If you have a guard that needs to be adjusted and located and put in place every time you do the process, that, you know, basically a guard that drops down before you activate, that's not a terribly reliable engineering control. It's got the same problems that PPE does. And so when I talk about source control, I'm talking about the fact that it's not protecting the wearer, at least not primarily. But I'm not suggesting that it's more reliable because it's a quote engineering control. And so I wouldn't raise it up the hierarchy of controls. The trouble is that while we've got multiple people in a location, we've got multiple sources, and we have to control them in some fashion. If you can do that by putting everybody in their own, you know, plexiglass booth, that's better than having everybody wear facial covering. But that assumes that all those plexiglass booths have their own HVAC system.
Okay, thank you. And then the 3-foot rule in
3-foot
the
rule vehicles. Yeah. I've had some people, we got comments that basically said, well, if 6 foot's protective, then how can you say 3 feet? That just shows none of this is based on, so I'm, okay, we could have said a 6-foot rule applies in a car. What we did is make an accommodation, sort of an anticipatory accommodation based on feasibility and making the requirement more feasible. That's actually why we did change it from what we had in the motor vehicle provision in agriculture, to say that it's the center point of the seats rather than 3 feet between. What that means in practice is that you can probably use the driver and passenger seat in a standard size pickup or a larger truck. You probably can't in a sedan or even in an SUV. You're probably a little bit under that. We've had some discussions about perhaps reducing it, but it's a recognition, and then whatever distance you achieve, everybody in the vehicle needs to be in a facial covering when there's more than one person in the vehicle. That would be true even if you could maintain 6 feet, because you're talking about a single ventilation system in a small cubic volume, and so those are really the two pieces. And in a sense, having everybody in a facial covering and not filling up the van are probably the critical things.
And this applies to general industry and not just the agricultural section.
The existing rule is in the ag standard that we adopted back in April. This rule would apply across the board to all employer-provided transportation. The question comes up whether that applies to commutes. It doesn't. The employer is not responsible for the commute. Now, some people, some businesses operate portal to portal, so it often, in that context, applies to the dispatch to a location. Some activities, you know, training, and this is again a question of whether we'll explicitly acknowledge this in the rule or recognize that it's there. You know, if you have to have a training driver sitting in the vehicle, if the vehicle doesn't allow for the 3-foot separation, you still have to have that driver in there. There are certainly circumstances in law enforcement where 2 officers in a single vehicle are called for. There are circumstances in the fire service when you're sending out an apparatus that you're not going to apply that 3-foot distance because you need to have the apparatus full. And ultimately, we view those in the context of the feasibility discussions.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Excellent. I've got 2 up. I've got Jason Wallace followed by Paul Fernari, except Paul's hand just went down. So, but Jason, you're up.
Can get off mute here. Can you hear me?
I was just about to say, Jason, if you're talking, you're on mute.
I was working on it. Hey, so obviously, you know, as we we moved forward with the COVID, we got to see a lot of stuff where employees were heightened sensitivity of, the employers weren't doing enough regardless of what the standards or the rules that were coming out. And I know I'm starting to get some phone calls like this week for the smoke, much in the same aspect. As we know, N95 and KN95 masks are not in huge supply, so it's not exactly like you can just run down and grab a couple hundred of them and there you go. So I've got some employees that are doing well, since we don't have that, we should just be sending everybody home, and if we don't do that, it's an unsafe workplace. We're limiting exposure, limiting who goes out and does what. We've offered up alternate masks, some of them obviously not as efficient as the N95. I just wanted to get your take on that and kind of how we would combat that with some of the employees.
What kind of work are you talking about?
Most of it is, some transfer work that's outside in our yard, not lengthy work, not a lot of strenuous work.
So even looking at the air quality index, I mean, there's an issue about cumulative exposure. So the real concern that led to the advisory that we issued, and safe is a relative term. I keep telling people that not in violation is not synonymous with safe. And there's clearly a room to say that, this isn't great and it's not necessarily healthy, but it doesn't rise to violation. And I think that's where we're talking about with a lot of the AQI stuff. I wouldn't have much concern with transitory activity. Even people running delivery routes who get the relief of being back in the vehicle, I don't think that is necessarily the same level of concern. The real concern is for people like agricultural workers, loggers, other construction workers who are working outside, doing hard work and doing it essentially continuously in the smoke. That's the biggest area of concern. It isn't something, we certainly aren't saying that if your job requires you to move around outside and do some activity outside occasionally during what's primarily an indoor job where you're in an effective HVAC system, that isn't the same level of concern. The AQI doesn't talk about the time-weighted average that we do when we talk about our PELs, but the time of exposure certainly matters.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you can rotate assignments, I think that's another effective way to control it that can avoid the need to shut things down entirely.
Well, and I think that's kind of what I was hoping you was hearing. It's getting a little more clarification, because what I'm seeing with some employees, much like we did early in COVID and a little bit with now, it's for lack of better words, I feel like it's some of them are just looking for that excuse for we should send them home so they don't have to work. And early on we had someone that was upset that we didn't shut everything down because of COVID, so they decided to make a complaint. Ultimately, it was unfounded. We had done everything there. So I'm just kind of getting a stance on where we are with this. Hopefully it's short-lived, but who knows?
Like I said, the air quality complaints this weekend topped COVID complaints. At least gave us a certain amount of variety.
Hey, change is good.
Not this change. Change would be good, but I want to choose the changes.
I feel you. Yes. Thank you, sir.
All right, Paul Fernari, do you still have a question?
Not really. Michael addressed it. I was going to ask about police cars and fire apparatus and the feasibility of it. So, yeah. I could say that, related to the question that came up earlier about potting, that's also something we've talked about in our fire stations as well, because they have living quarters. So something else to keep in mind for you.
I almost said that that's one of the, that's one of the things that we have sort of specifically resisted, because they have living quarters, but it's transitory. And so as we talk about it in the context of the temporary rule, that's an open question, specifically for fire stations.
All right, so I don't have any other hands up, but if anybody has a question for Michael, this is a great opportunity. There's no stupid questions. There's no silly questions. This is a safe environment for you to ask your question, and you've got a whole bunch of people who are challenged in the same way. So let us help each other. Lee Manning has a question.
Hi, Michael Wood. How you doing? I have a question. I just kind of want to know, since COVID-19 and fires and everything, how has that impacted other rulemaking that you guys have been working on? And do you see anything else coming in down the pike? And I realize that this is kind of like a no-brainer, but I just
Well,
because I'm dealing with the same thing. We're kind of getting pulled away from things that we had planned to do. So I kind of wanted to hear what was going on with the current rulemaking that isn't have to do with that.
some of you may recall that in the latter half of last year, we were talking a lot about an ambitious public policy agenda that we were still narrowing and that we were calling Agenda 2025. We were going to finalize it in March or April. That never happened. Infectious diseases had been discussed and discarded. That changed. So a lot of what we might have begun early rulemaking activity did sort of get pushed to the wayside. Now, there are some exceptions of things that were fairly far along. We've been having discussions about ag labor housing generally. Those have largely been suspended, but we'll probably be picking those up again. We had discussions about the non-entry structural firefighting, kind of the issue for small districts where they don't have the ability to really do a structural firefight, but they need to do. I keep referring to it as the surround and drown standard, and Renee Stapleton, my policy manager, keeps telling me to quit that, but that's still what I think of it as. So we'd largely worked out language for that rule. We haven't gone forward with it as a formal proposal. That'll probably happen at some point when we can catch our breath. We did have the manganese standard out for public hearing when all this broke. We had the first hearing, we canceled the later hearings, but left the comment period open. We've gathered all those comments, and we do expect to go forward with rulemaking with a decision on adoption in October sometime, probably with a delayed effective date of at least till July of next year. And that's primarily a welding standard. It's about the manganese exposures, but it provides a safe harbor in the context of welding. And so that rule was largely done, and we will go forward with that rule. Really, as soon as we get a rules coordinator hired. In the midst of all this, my crackerjack rules coordinator got hired by the retirement folks, and I haven't yet figured out exactly how to retaliate in a way that they'll know what I know. When the guy
are being recorded.
When the guy called for a reference check, I did threaten an inspection. I was joking, and he clearly knew that, just for the record. But so we have to hire and train a new person. We're going to use the manganese rule as part of the training. We also have we had two rules that we had just proposed in February, updating the penalties to the new amounts in line with federal OSHA and making some other technical changes related to penalties, as well as the employer knowledge, employer responsibilities rule. We extended the comment period and rescheduled those hearings. We have now done that again, and so those hearings are coming up. We'll be doing those hearings virtually, although we did provide an option for people who really want to do it in person at our Portland field office, but we've asked people to sign up in advance. Since we're doing them virtually, we're doing one in the afternoon, one in the evening, and we're doing one entirely in Spanish, on both those rulemaking proposals. Those, by the time the dust settles, the public comment period will have extended for 8 months when we actually get to making a decision. And we have received comments over that period as well. So ultimately, I think we'll probably move forward with decisions on both those rules late in the year, because we have to do something to get them resolved as they're hanging fire in process. And then, of course, we're going to be moving on infectious diseases on the permanent rulemaking. That's really everything that we have in place. Some of the other things that we've talked about and thought about are simply on hold. You know, Action 2025 probably becomes Action 2028 by the time all the dust settles.
Excellent. We are approaching 1 o'clock, so I want to flag that for folks, but I did at one point see a hand from Evan Church. Evan, did you still have a question?
Nope, I'm good, Christy. Thanks,
Okay.
Michael.
Thank you. All right, any last questions for Michael? Okay. Thank you so much for your time. It was super informative. It's always love to hear your perspective and hear all the great things OR-OSHA is doing to protect our employees. So thank you for that.
Thank you, and thank all of you, because we all know that really where the rubber hits the road is in the work that a lot of you do to protect the employees in the state. And it doesn't get acknowledged often enough, certainly by the broader public, and even in times like these. This is a challenging job at the best of times. These aren't the best of times. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, and before we leave the meeting, I did want to flag one of the things we really wanted to talk about was what the membership would like to do in the future, because we normally have monthly in-person meetings at the Sizzler, and of course we are not doing that right now. And I think this virtual environment has actually opened up an opportunity for people who either weren't aware of ASSP to join us and to learn, you know, how they can engage and how they can expand their safety knowledge and skills. And we also want to make sure we're bringing you meaningful content during a pandemic, a wildland fire, a protest environment, whatever the next hazard is coming. I vote it's Godzilla. So I'm interested in hearing what kind of needs you all have and if this is valuable for you. So if you have feedback, please let me know.
Yeah, I think it worked. Yeah, I think it worked well. I have used Zoom meetings, Ring Central meetings. This is my first time on this Microsoft Team meeting, and I think it, you know, hit all the buttons and did what was needed. So congratulations for putting this together. I do miss the salad bar, however, and I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with that.
We'll have a really big salad when it's all over, right?
You're on.
All right. And I'm a hugger, man. I miss hugs. So when we all get vaccinated, I'm squeezing y'all. So watch out, with consent, of course. I won't do it if you don't like it. Anybody else have feedback on, is there another speaker you want to hear from? Is it valuable for us to just get together in a room and say, hey, what are you guys doing? This is my challenge, and just sort of networking that way? Is there any particular topics? And Jason and I will see what we can do.
Again, I like the idea of networking. If there is a specific topic on, you know, maybe sourcing safety equipment, N95, that sort of stuff, I was able to find some on Granger today, but they're not going to be delivered for a little while. So yeah, any little tips or tricks that people can use, you know, to how they're dealing with stuff in the workplace. I think any information we can just shove into the input is going to give us better output. So I definitely like this. I think we should do it next month, whether we have a speaker or we just get together and answer a series of questions. I think it's very valuable. So.
Excellent. And I see a note in the chat that we need more advance notice, and you are absolutely right. This is our normally programmed time. Some of the folks that normally do this sort of notification, some of us have had to evacuate or work in different parts of the wildland fire that we didn't expect. So I'm super impressed that with less than a day's notice, we got 35 people to attend. So thank you for that. We will do it differently next time. So, and those of you who had to run, I know you're gone now, but thank you for joining us. Okay. Any last feedback? Mr. Lance Hughes, do you have anything you need to talk about before we go?
Lance had to drop off for ICS meeting, so
Okay.
yeah, he'll follow up with you a little bit later.
Okay. And it was mostly any ASSP board business that needed to get done in this meeting. We'll have to catch it up next time. So I will, this recording becomes a viewable after the fact link that I will send out to this group. So if somebody wasn't able to attend, I think they can watch it. You can watch it again. I won't, because seeing myself on video was torturous. But I think if you forward the link to other people, they can watch it. I'm not 100% positive of that. So if you think you found something valuable and you think your coworker who is not an ASSP member or is on the safety committee or whatever, whoever, you can share that with them. So please share the safety knowledge. That's what we're here for, is to lift each other up and take care of our people. All right. I guess that's a wrap. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the meeting. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.